I was told that you are very well known about the curriculum development. So
Yes.
my first questions belong to this topic.
Right.
So I did a list because you have a very interesting CV as well. So how should the national identity be reflected in the school curriculum without becoming nationalist?
I think that's a very important question, and that's the big distinction that has to be made. I think it is perfectly legitimate and important to see the school curriculum as a means of giving people the information, the background that they need to construct a national identity. And that means making sure that in the history curriculum, for example, the core narrative of the nation's history is what people are learning. So that they can make of that what they wish to make of it, without forcing them to interpret it in a particular way. But it needs to be shown from its beginnings up to fairly recently, not necessarily right up to the present day, but to not very far away. And it needs to show both the good things and the bad things. It doesn't need to concentrate just on the great heroes of the past, and it doesn't need to concentrate on all the sins of the past, which is what tends to happen in English and US history teaching at the moment. We learn about the slave trade and the empire and the bad things that were done in the empire. We don't learn as much as we should about some of the benefits that the empire brought, and we certainly often don't hear about the way the British Navy for 100 years went all around the globe to try and abolish the slave trade, having abolished slavery in its own empire. So we need to see the good and the bad, and that will give people the means to construct their own national identity. And that applies also to the literature curriculum. It applies to the arts. We need to know what the national traditions are in that area, and that has often been neglected because the feeling has often been that in some Western countries, not I'm sure in Hungary, that it's more important to develop global citizens than it is to develop national citizens. I think it is important to develop a sense of one's belonging to a wider humanity, and one has to be conscious of the way in which every country in the world is impacted by developments very distant from itself. But at the core of the curriculum, at the core of most people's identity, is still the nation. And therefore that should be a very important part of the school curriculum. What we don't need is forcing it down people's throats. We don't need telling people to shut up when they're being critical about things. You want freedom of expression in the classroom, but you want to give them the basis for developing a sense of where they belong.
In the United States, when they speak about nation, it's completely different what we mean here in Europe, because we have the nation states since Napoleon.
Yes.
But what's the issue in the UK, where you had the English, the Scottish, and you have a lot of so-called British, the immigrants? So how can you make the curriculum good for everyone?
It is extremely difficult and a major challenge. I think people in the United Kingdom have a number of different identities. I think if you're well established in England, you can feel yourself to be English. I think there are some immigrant communities who don't feel themselves to be English, but there are many immigrant communities, such as the Jewish community in North London, who've been there for a long time. They're very, very Jewish. They have a close affinity with the State of Israel, but they feel themselves to be part of England as well. And then you can be part of Britain and part of the wider United Kingdom, which includes part of Ireland. I myself, as an Englishman whose ancestry goes back to the 17th century on both sides, with nobody outside England on the family tree at all, is very English, but I feel British. I have a sense of loyalty to the United Kingdom. And I think that's true of many Welsh people and many Scottish people. Not all Scottish people. Some Scottish people, very, very large numbers of Scottish people, and I lived in Scotland for many years, are very keen to be independent, but at the moment they're part of British, and many of the Scots I know feel themselves to be Scottish and British. I think one of the problems we've had in education in England is that people have been very apologetic about not wanting to force a kind of English identity on immigrant communities. So they've emphasised multiculturalism, they've emphasised the retention of cultural traditions. I think it's fine for cultural traditions to be kept, but schools are places where you develop a civic sense of identity. And I think if we tried harder in education, we would have had more people in these immigrant communities feeling that, as well as having links to Bangladesh, as well as being part of an Islamic religion, are also part of England. And there are such people. I mean, for example, the right-wing populist party that's now at the top of the polls in England, the Reform Party, its chairman is a Muslim businessman, and he is a practicing Muslim, and he's a very devout Muslim, but he's passionately English and passionately British, and that we would have had much more of that if we'd had an education system that was not as apologetic as it has been.
Also, Farage has German citizenship, as I read it before, so he's also like keeping more sticks in the fire, as we say. Yeah, it's interesting. And what is the role of the traditional and classical knowledge in modern education?
Well, it depends what you mean by classical. The way in which MCC is using it is a traditional education focused on the transmission of knowledge in different parts of the curriculum. In England, we tend to say classical when we're referring to the civilization of Greece and Rome and the learning of Latin and Greek. And until the end of the 19th century, most people who were being educated from the middle and upper classes were being educated in Latin and Greek. And indeed, Winston Churchill, in his memoirs, talks about how the fact that he never got the hang of Greek, he could never understand Greek, and he was put in a special class for slow-learning boys to do English literature instead, which is why he ended up as one of England's greatest prose writers, because he was a backward boy who couldn't follow the main curriculum. But I mean, since then, the word has come to, and this is how MCC uses it now, come to mean a traditional education which is focused on knowledge transmission, and what it is not focused on is things like social and emotional learning, relationship education, sexuality education, or any of the things like gender ideology and climate change, which quite a lot of progressive educators see as the main purpose of the school curriculum, to mould people into a certain set of beliefs. The traditional education, the classical education, is to give you all this knowledge, give you all this background, and you make of it yourself. It forms your judgment, it gives you a whole range of reference to draw on, but you end up having different views.
Do you believe that there is a universal set of values which should undermine all education systems?
I think there is at a minimum level, and I think that's probably sufficient to get people from different religious backgrounds and people with no religious background to live comfortably together without major disagreement. And in fact, when I was Chief Executive of England's Curriculum and Assessment Agency for 6 years in the 1990s, we set up something called the National Forum on Values. And we got together people, a large number of people of many different backgrounds, to see to what, including Muslims and Hindus and atheists and passionate Catholics and Methodists and Anglicans, to see to what extent we could agree. And we did agree on a very basic set of values. We issued a statement of values, and it was added to the national curriculum at the end of the 1990s. I think it's largely been ignored in practice by schools, but I think what we did was give the lie to the naive ethical relativism which was prevalent at the time, that there really aren't any common values that you share. We just have to agree to disagree. What we found was that the values were shared, but they were applied in different ways. People had different views about euthanasia and abortion and so on, but some of the fundamental principles were agreed, and at least they allowed, among people who don't shout at each other, allowed a genuine rational debate to take place. Forget my thread.
And what do you see as the most critical mistake in the recent educational reforms in the UK or globally?
I think the big mistake is not to focus on the transmission of knowledge, but to feel that you are there to mould people's behaviour, to bring the home and the community into the school, rather than keeping the school as to some extent a place apart. I think traditionally the school has been a place apart where you sometimes actually unlearn some of the things that are happening in the outside world. And the view has been that we must open the school to the community. And I think that diminishes the value of the school to people. In the past, people could be very excited because they were doing something very different. Now the community is brought into the home, the values of the world around are brought into the school. And I think that makes it less interesting to many people.
And how can education policy remain evidence-based while respecting cultural and moral frameworks? While respecting cultural and moral frameworks.
I think there is a limit to how far you respect cultural frameworks. I think there is an obligation on the part of communities that have been recently established in the country to go some way to fit themselves into the wider society. So that, for example, in a very famous school in London called the Michaela School, which is one of the government's free schools, it's state-funded, but it has a certain amount of freedom over its curriculum. It is a very multi-ethnic, very multicultural school with a majority of non-white and non-Christian children, and the head is immensely successful. It's full of children from very disadvantaged backgrounds, people who go home to a home where nobody speaks English, and it has one of the highest rates of acceptance into top universities of any state school in the country. And it does that by being homogeneous and not by giving way to different communal pressures. And recently there was a major pressure on the school to set aside Muslim prayer rooms. And the head refused to do this on the grounds that whatever you do outside school is absolutely fine, we respect it, but in school we do together. We don't do things together that separate us. We do things that unify us and make us feel that we're part of a scholarly community. And she went to the High Court and the High Court supported her. That's the kind of pressure that most people, most heads would be terrified of being cancelled and dismissed and driven out by the community, but this woman is tough. She's known by the tabloid press as England's strictest headmistress. But it's obviously a brilliant school, where people love learning, and children from very difficult backgrounds go off to Oxford and Cambridge. Extraordinary.
Well, how can schools balance teaching moral values without imposing a particular worldview?
Without imposing a
particular worldview?
I think, to some extent, a school does have a worldview, in that there are certain things that you accept and certain things that you don't accept. And the schools only exist as really moral places that are rule-based. Otherwise it's chaos and anarchy. You've got to have a set of rules. Some of them may seem slightly more uncomfortable in the eyes of some communities than others, but you have to have this. But I think generally it is possible to get a set of rules that most people will accept, that just need to be strictly enforced. But I don't think it's imposing a worldview. I think it's very important not to indoctrinate people into feeling, for example, that global citizenship is an irrelevance. I know a head in Canada who won't have any talk of world citizenship. I'd be perfectly happy with older children in particular, that people are putting forward that view. I mean, that's absolutely, one wants free debate. What one wants is to get people used to talking to each other and disagreeing in a way that doesn't lead to open warfare and an acceptance that, okay, at the end of the day, we've tried very hard, we've explored, we've moved a bit one way or the other, but, there is this gap between us, we don't agree, but that's what the world's like. People don't agree and they have to live together when they don't agree. So I think it's possible for a good, but it's difficult. I mean, running a school is really difficult in the present world. It's always been difficult, but it's particularly difficult in the present world.
As I was told, in Britain right now, the state finance schools should have like the same level of education, but it's different by districts, by villages, by cities, and when the parents have to choose or they decide to have a better school for their children, then they just move to a better neighborhood. Is that correct?
That happens, yes. Some of the best state schools are in middle class areas where house prices are going up because people are moving so that their children are in the catchment area of the local school. It's not as strict as, you don't necessarily have to live in the catchment area. You have a better chance of getting your child in if you are living within the zone around the school. It's not totally forbidden to take people from outside, but it's much more difficult. So you do put people moving in, and these are the better areas, and the prices are going up and it's deterring other people from getting that education. The biggest differences are not necessarily between different areas in the south of England, but between the area around London and other parts of the country. I mean, some of the lowest levels of attainment are in the places where I grew up. When I was born in Stoke-on-Trent in Staffordshire, it has some of the worst results in the whole country. I then went to school in Yorkshire, which has about the next worst results. And the gap between them and the worst parts of London is huge. I mean, the worst parts of London are doing very much better, despite massive disadvantage. I mean, it's partly that money's been poured into London schools, and it's partly that young teachers like being in London until they get married and find they can't possibly live there and have a family and have to move somewhere else. But some of the best teachers in their early years are working in the London schools, and they're very visible as well when there are problems, and they're attended to. But the neglected parts of the country are in the provinces, in particular in the West Midlands and the North, and in some coastal areas. Some of our most deprived towns are the former coastal resorts that the middle classes used to go to, but no longer go to because they go to the Costa Brava or the Costa del Sol. And these are places full of immigrants. This is where they put immigrants who come in and awaiting decision as to their refugee status. They go into all the coastal towns, and there's high levels of deprivation.
What educational trends do you find most promising and most worrying in today's systems?
Educational strengths?
Yes.
I don't find any strengths particularly worrying. If it's a strength, then it's a strength, and it's something that we should celebrate. The weaknesses are to do with teacher supply. We're not getting the best people necessarily. It's something I'm going to be talking about tonight. And for example, at the moment, and I will mention this evening, the government's pretty desperate in putting adverts in the Caribbean and Africa for teachers to come and teach in particular London schools because they can't attract enough people to do that. And some of these people are very good, but whether they are the people who should be really producing an education which is helping to develop a sense of national identity when they don't have it themselves is arguable. That's one weakness. The other weakness is the extent to which initial teacher training has been infiltrated with all sorts of crazy work ideas about gender ideology and putting climate change before anything else in the curriculum, and that things should be squeezed out so that you're dealing with contemporary issues. The fact that we have 31% turnover of teachers within 5 years, so there's a huge turnover, which means that many schools are full of teachers who come straight out of these teacher training institutions where they've been inducted into how to promote workery in the classroom, which is unfortunate. And there's a big reaction against it, but I mean it is a major issue. And we have a left-wing Labour Secretary of State for Education who seems to want to make the curriculum less knowledge-based, less demanding, more open to the world of the contemporary world, whatever that means. And we await curriculum proposals with dread.
And what do you find promising?
Promising is a reaction against many of these developments, both by some teachers and by parents. I see it particularly in Scotland, which has seen the worst excesses of progressive education, where they've virtually abandoned the teaching of subjects at all. They've introduced some years ago a curriculum called Curriculum for Excellence, which makes everyone laugh because the last thing it does is promote excellence. It undermines academic excellence. And at last there is a grassroots reaction by some teachers and by a lot of parents, in particular because of the infusion of gender ideology into Scotland. Scotland have been crazy about this and extreme by comparison with England. And there's an excellent organisation called the Scottish Union of Education, which is nothing to do with the trade union. It's a union of parents and concerned teachers that's really active. And I was in Scotland for 16 years and know the Scottish education system well, and have been appalled at how it's deteriorated since I left in about 1990. And I think that there is a grassroots rebellion about it, which is really encouraging.
How can we prepare students not just for jobs but for citizenship and ethical life in the 20th
We should not prepare them for this by giving them a biased form of citizenship education, which basically tells them that what they should be concerned about is identifying the distinction between victims and oppressors and always supporting the victims or so-called victims. We shouldn't be infusing them with gender ideology. We shouldn't be telling them that climate change comes before anything else. We should be telling them about the system of the constitutional arrangements in the country, so that they have a civic education. They're told the facts. They learn about contemporary politics, but in a neutral, unbiased way. And also, we give them opportunities at school to participate in activities which show how they can do things together as a group and how they can perhaps help their local community. There are a lot of ventures in schools by which people go out and do things in the community, and this gives them a sense of belonging to a wider unit and gives them actual practice in helping out, which one hopes they will continue to do later.
Just the last question. What should be taken from the British system to the Hungarian, and what should be taken from the Hungarian education system to the British one? What's your...
I think there's a greater concern for knowledge. I mean, my knowledge of the Hungarian system is not as great as it should be. I do get the impression that there's a much greater emphasis on knowledge transmission. I am delighted that people continue studying history until they leave school in Hungary. You can stop it at 13 in some schools in England. You're supposed to continue it until 14. Most people drop it at 14 legally. Some schools drop it illegally at the age of 13. And also, I mean, Hungary clearly has a strong national consciousness which it wishes to transmit. And when I talked about education being for the sake of national identity in the 1990s, when I was the government's chief advisor on the curriculum. I was described as a cultural imperialist, a cultural restorationist, a neo-racist, and all sorts of other things. And that wouldn't happen in Hungary, and that's a much healthier climate to be an educator.
Thank you.
Is that okay? Thank you.